Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Michelle Phillip, Associate Professor and Head Department of English, Wilson College. I'm very happy to be part of this revision lecture series for TYBA English, organized by BNN College B1D. Today's lecture is on popular culture. Before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude to Sri Vijay Jadhav, President, and Sri Balkrishna Kale, Executive President, Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav, Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, Dr. Ashok Wagh, Principal, BNN College, and Dr. Sudhir Nigam, Head Department of English, BMM College, and Chairperson, Board of Studies English. Today's session is on popular culture, and since students have already studied the concepts of popular culture in semester 5, today's session would be looking primarily at semester 6 and the concepts that they would have to be familiar with and the case studies that they would have to examine and present in their exam answer papers. In semester 5, they would have been introduced to the concept of popular culture. They would have looked at popular culture defined as folk culture, the authentic culture of the people, working class culture, which is believed to be the source of symbolic protest within contemporary capitalism. They would also be looking at Antonio Gramsci's view of popular culture as a site for struggle and negotiation between the forces of resistance of the subordinate groups and the forces of incorporation of the dominant groups. The student would already be familiar with the structuralist and post-structuralist theories of Saussure, Roland Barthes, and would be aware of how to apply these theories to deconstruct cultural texts and practices of popular culture. We will now move on to the 3 units that are prescribed for study for semester 6 of popular culture. The first unit deals with gender and popular culture. If you will look with me at the slide, Unit 1 heads Gender and Popular Culture, presenting the feminist approach to popular culture, subversions of femininity and masculinity in popular culture, visual pleasure, narrative cinema, scopophilia and the male gaze, ignoring the female spectator, the Bechdel test. In order to understand all these theoretical concepts, the student would be expected to apply them to mainstream cinema and female spectatorship. They would also be looking at the films of Alfred Hitchcock from the perspective of his treatment of women, as well as the films of Madhur Bhandarkar, mostly the female-centric films, or any films that deal with strong female protagonists. Now, if you notice, I have presented the content of this unit in the form of a question. So, Unit 1 contains 3 questions, question A and B being essays, and question C being short notes. Now, I have also indicated in blue and pale red the topics that will be covered in the short note, as well as in blue the subjects that can be questioned for the essay question. Moving on, I have a sample question here for Unit 1. Question 1 says, female characters are portrayed in film as passive and powerless. Deliberate this argument using feminist theory with relevant examples. Question 1b says, examine the treatment of women in the films of Hitchcock or Bhandarkar. Now, some students may prefer to look at Western films. For them, Hitchcock is the director that they will be studying, and those who prefer to look at mainstream Hindi cinema can look at the films of Madhur Bhandarkar or any other directors who present women in a powerful role. Short notes would deal with the Bechdel test, scopophilia, psychoanalytical perspectives on feminist readings of film, and subversions of femininity. Now, what do we expect when we pose questions like this to the candidate? Here is a model answer of what the assessor expects a student to understand and explain and express in an answer for the exam. The student would necessarily have to look at the way in which men and women are portrayed in cinema. A gendered approach is intended to get the student to look not only at the way in which women are portrayed, but also in the manner in which toxic masculinities are presented to spectators in today's media. We look at how women are portrayed as powerless and passive. They would have to mention how women are objectified and how their role is tailor-made for male desire. The student would also have to express how women are lacking in agency, or whether they have choices and they have the right to take decisions regarding their own lives and the lives of those in their close family circles. We would also look at the portrayal of women and the way in which mainstream cinema reinforces the idea of female subjectivity, portraying men as powerful and women as being the damsel in distress. As mentioned earlier, the student should also touch upon the concept of toxic masculinities and look at whether there are representations in cinema that are subversive or that challenge the status quo. One of the questions that the students should consider or deliberate on is whether traditional roles produce misogyny. In order to effectively answer the questions posed for this unit, the student would have to present a strong theoretical foundation on which to build their analysis. For this, they would have to look at cultural theory and spectatorship theory, how struggle over meaning is the prime focus of an individual, how they negotiate their own identities, and how popular culture texts and practices consumed by women are considered to be gendered. Tanya Modleski contends that scholars who examine feminine narratives adopt three positions: that of dismissiveness, hostility, or mockery. Yet, one cannot ignore mass-produced fantasies because of the manner in which they influence the lives of women. The conditions that make it necessary to study these mass fantasies should be looked at, and some examples should be presented. The seminal work of Laura Mulvey, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, should be outlined to show how films produce and reproduce the male gaze. Laura Mulvey introduces us to the concept of scopophilia, to voyeurism, and to what needs to be done in order for the destruction of pleasure. I will deal with this when we go into a little greater detail in the next slide. The essay of Jackie Stacey, Stargazing and Female Spectatorship, and the way in which she describes the act of consuming mass-produced fantasies and the rationale for their consumption as escapism or identification and consumption. Moving on to the Bechdel test. Now, the Bechdel test was a test created by Alison Bechdel in 1985, aimed to measure the level of female representation in film and television. Now, the Bechdel test was intended to examine whether a film was female oriented or not, whether the female was represented well enough. In order to do this, Alison Bechdel uses 3 criteria. She asks, are there at least 2 named female characters in the film? 2 female characters who have names. Do these 2 female characters talk to each other? And do they talk to each other about something other than a man or marriage? Now, these 3 questions, however, were criticized for being too simplistic a way of looking at whether a film was female oriented or not, and only presented a Western paradigm. At the same time, Alison Bechdel's test chose to ignore whether the film was of a good quality standard or not. Now, the Bechdel test is one gauge that can be applied to a film to look at whether representation is done, representation of women is done in a balanced manner. Now we go on to the concept of scopophilia. Scopophilia refers to the pleasure of looking and of being looked at. It's derived from Freudian psychoanalysis and Jacques Lacan's concept of the gaze. It's also connected to the concept of voyeurism. Now these two are applied by Laura Mulvey, who uses this psychoanalytic and film theory to examine spectatorship, and she attempts to explain how the act of looking itself is a form of self-gratification. The apparatus, the cinematic apparatus, is not gender neutral. It's an apparatus which is set for the pleasure of the male character. The spectator, the camera, and the male characters all look at the object on the screen, which happens to be the woman. The female character is presented as an object. The female character is objectified and is an object to be looked at. Now, Laura Mulvey's theory presents this, and I have given it in a nutshell since we have to cover it, the entire syllabus in a short span of time. But roughly, these are the concepts that one needs to look at and apply it to the study of cinema. So one can look at, for example, not just the story of the film, but also how the cinematic apparatus is set. The very act of viewing the film in a darkened cinema hall, where there is a contact made between the spectator and the characters on the screen, and a connect established between the two. Film theory outlines that the act of watching a film is a very personal act, and it influences and impacts the spectator. Now, in the case of Laura Mulvey, Christine Gledhill criticizes her for not considering the role of the female spectator. Laura Mulvey's essay is aimed primarily at the spectator who happens to be male, and it is his pleasure that she looks at. Other feminist film critics have considered that the woman as woman is no thing. She is nothing. She does not exist, and her desires are completely nullified. Now, the concept of Laura Mulvey's scopophilia as well as the male gaze will all be applied to films that have to be studied for this particular unit. Now, for example, a film can be taken like, let's say, English Winglish, and the way in which Sri Devi is portrayed in that character can be studied. Now, here is a woman who, without the knowledge of her family, signs up for spoken English classes. She suffers pangs of guilt at not having told her family, and especially is on tenterhooks when her family joins her in a foreign country, in this foreign country, for a wedding that is to take place. Now, at the end of the story, Sri Devi doesn't go for her exam to complete the course. Instead, chooses to stay home and participate in the festivities of the wedding. However, her niece has realized what has been happening and invites the entire group to the home to be part of the wedding celebration. The end of the story sees Sri Devi go back to the role of the traditional Bharatiya Nari. Now, a film like this may not be a very feminist film. It would not be a feminist film at all. However, here we see the slippages or the slight acts of agency expressed by a woman. And at the end of the narrative, she makes this choice to go back to her traditional role of wife and mother. Yet we see a slight change in her demeanor, where she has studied a bit of English and is able to communicate and not have to bear the insults and barbs of her family like she had to do earlier. We now move on to Unit 2, Postmodernism and Culture. Under this, we will be looking at the concept of the global postmodern, reality, mediated reality, pluralism of value, and the theorists would be John Story, Francois Lyotard, Frederick Jameson, and Jean Baudrillard. There will also be a requirement of studying the perspective of how both Western and Indian cultural paradigms have evolved. And some examples given are films like Shrek, Johnny English, Pulp Fiction, Amores Perros, and Coffee and Cigarettes. Now, Francois Lyotard introduces us to the concept of the incredulity to meta-narratives. Now, what are these overarching meta-narratives? In FYBA, you would have studied the story structure of Freytag. It's called Freytag's Pyramid or Freytag's Triangle. And here we look at how conflict gives rise to tension, which reaches a climax, after which there is falling tension, but there is also an important concept of denouement, which implies that all loose ends are tied up. Now, this is a contradiction because in reality, we don't find loose ends being tied up. And the overarching truth of the narrative, which is that good will be rewarded and bad will be punished, rarely is experienced in our lives. Now, this is your traditional story structure, which ties up loose ends as it approaches the conclusion of the story. Aristotle's Poetics tells us that there should be unity of time, place, and action. Action indicating that there should be one prime story. That one prime story implies that the stories of the hero or the protagonist are of prime importance. The hero would be somebody of a high stature, a king or a warrior, on whose decisions the safety and the well-being of that city or country would rest. Now, this story structure implies that it is the experiences of the hero that are of importance. It is an overarching story which hides contradictions. Take, for example, The Merchant of Venice, where Portia and Bassanio are our primary couple, and Bassanio's friendship with Antonio become the pivot for the money that was borrowed from Shylock the Jew. Now, we also have characters like Nerissa and the daughter of Shylock, who have experiences whose experiences form the subplots of Shakespeare's plays, and yet at the end of the story, all of their experiences will tie up with this one overarching story and be part of Portia's conclusion and her experiences. So, the intention of a postmodern narrative is to present us with the fractured narratives, the fluid narratives, offering multiple voices and many perspectives. Postmodern narratives are fragmented, and most importantly, they express the idea that there is no such thing as an absolute truth. This has been made possible because of the influx of technology as well as cultural multiplicity, which demanded new ways of representation. Whereas traditional ways hid contradictions, postmodern narratives allowed these contradictions to thrive. Now, the theory of Jean Baudrillard introduces us to the concept of hyperreality, to simulacra and simulacrum. And here we are looking at how, through the essays of Walter Benjamin, where he looks at the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, we find that with the ability to reproduce, whether it is art, whether it is music, whether it is film, what we have is a series of copies without an original. Now, considering the concept of hyperreality, we've heard children exclaim how beautiful a place is, and saying, "Mom, this looks so much like Disneyland." There was a time when we explained how Disneyland was like Kashmir or Switzerland and how it represented the jungles of Africa. No longer does Disney become the replica of nature, but nature becomes described using the paradigm of Disneyland. The idea of simulacra and simulacrum is where reality is simulated. And for this, I would like to refer you to the film The Truman Show, an absolute must-watch film. The Truman Show is very much like our Big Boss reality shows. However, here is a man from whose birth the world has been watching his every action, his every milestone in his growth. Unbeknownst to him, all the people around him, including his family members, his boss and friends, are all characters and part of a set. They are all actors and part of a set. Now he realizes towards the end that there is something strange going on, and there seems to be a repetition in his daily activities. And that's when he begins to explore and question whether this whole life is real or hyperreal. I won't spoil it for you by giving you, I won't spoil it for you by explaining the end of the film. You need to go and watch it. Now, during the Los Angeles riots, when there was rioting all over the city and the people were afraid for their own safety, the police did not have enough of personnel to deploy to reassure the people. And what they did instead was put cardboard cutouts of police cars and police personnel in the worst hit neighborhoods. TV cameras filmed this, and when they were shown to the viewers, the viewers were reassured that there was indeed police personnel and help was at hand if required. Now, a similar thing happened when the Bandra Worli Sea Link first started. People began to speed on that sea link, and there were some very bad accidents. And hence, the police set up a checkpoint with speed guns to fine defaulters. After a bit, rather than put policemen there, they decided that a cutout of a policeman and a car would be more appropriate. So from far away, a person approaching at high speed would see the silhouette of the policeman and slow down. On nearing, he would realize that that was just a cardboard cutout. But the cardboard cutout was effective in slowing the driver down. Now, is this not cheating the people? Yes, it is. But this is how we are being fooled by images circulated in the media, in the way in which these images are arranged, the way in which these concepts, this news is conveyed to us, and based on who conveys this news and how well he can convince us, we begin to believe. Now, you and I are now facing this lockdown, and our news comes to us not only through the media but also through memes, through WhatsApp messages. And we are convinced if the claim of authenticity or the source of a particular document is valid. Very often we forward information and later realize that it was nothing but false news. And here I would look at Jameson's last point, where we say that performativity is the key. How well one convinces others about the fact that one is model material, or one is a good singer, or one is actually visiting Disneyland or Switzerland or Spain. In postmodern culture, and particularly with access to the kind of media that we have people who are YouTube bloggers, travel bloggers, but have never visited any place in the world. Now, this is what is the idea of simulation, simulacra and simulacrum, where reality is recreated for you, where the signifiers are arranged in a particular way in order to present you with copies, sometimes without even an original. Jameson introduces us, taking the concepts of Lyotard and Baudrillard, to the fact that meta-narratives of science seem to have legitimized knowledge. Whether it's Marxist theory, whether it is science, whether it is philosophy, what it did was present us with an overarching absolute truth, which in a way gave us a false sense of freedom and well-being. Okay? This postmodern culture and society transitioned into a vast range of activities like drama, dance, architecture, film, women's movements, and so many other modalities which could be used to present our perspectives and our views. Now, taking all these concepts, one would then apply it to a cultural text or practice. And for this, I would suggest some films, and I'll go back to the previous slide, where I look at a film like Shrek or Johnny English, or let's say Pulp Fiction. A film like Amores Perros or Coffee and Cigarettes. Now, I would look at Pulp Fiction, which is a film it's a Quentin Tarantino film that presents us with a fractured narrative. The story goes back and forth, and it isn't like a flashback or a flash forward. What Pulp Fiction does is present us with the story of three different sets of individuals. And sometimes it overturns the filmic concept of cause and effect. The film Amores Perros also has three narratives. The visual narrative as well as the film story both dovetail in visually in a car crash and through the narrative in the ownership and the experiences of individuals with their pet dogs. The story has to do with dog fights, and yet they are not one story with one overarching narrative. They are three different stories which dovetail through the dogs owned by the people and through the visual of a car crash. So these concepts of hyperreality and of simulation can be explored through the deconstruction of these films. We now come to Unit 3. We will now look at Unit 3, and I'll begin by reading the contents of the syllabus. Unit 3 deals with taste, identity, and popular culture. The first topic is Culture Industry Revisited, Frankfurt School and Consumerism, the Politics of Popular Taste, and Privilege and Taste. There will also be a need to understand case studies from the perspective of advertising and how the media promotes consumerism. The culture industry is a term that is coined by Adorno and Horkheimer, describing how pop culture functions in a capitalist society. They explain that pop culture acts as an industry, producing standardized products which in turn produce standardized people. The mechanism of capitalism is cultural more than economical, which means that they are aimed only at profit, but are also significantly aimed at producing consumers who are well adapted to the strengthening of the capitalist system. Take, for example, films and TV shows that portray glamorous, well-to-do characters in exotic, stylish settings. Not only is the setting aesthetic to look at, but it also prompts individual spectators to also desire or want to adopt this as their ideal. It becomes a goal set for themselves. The culture industry is marked by standardization, which is controlled by capitalism, and it produces the idea of a pseudo-individualism. It leads you to believe that you are taking a decision, that you are unique, and that you have choices. What it does is produces a false sense of unity with a particular subculture or a particular group of people. The Frankfurt School, which was established in 1923, was aimed at unifying different strands of Marxist theory. It was based on the Marxist concept of ideology and concerned itself with the political, economic, and social conditions that made social change possible. Unlike Matthew Arnold and Lewisism, who worried about the anarchist power of pop culture, the Frankfurt School saw popular culture as a threat. The Frankfurt School believed that popular culture actually produced the opposite effect. I will repeat that. Unlike Matthew Arnold and Lewisism, that saw only the anarchist perspective of popular culture, they saw pop culture as a threat to cultural and social authority. The Frankfurt School, on the other hand, believed that popular culture actually produced the opposite effect, that of conformity, that the masses were deceived through a circle of manipulation and retroactive need in which the unity of the system, in this case a capitalist system, grows even stronger. Leo Lowenthal, another member of the Frankfurt School, sees the culture industry as producing a culture marked by, and I quote, standardization, stereotype, conservatism, mendacity, manipulated consumer goods, which in turn works towards the depoliticizing of the working class. Cultural products work to limit the political and economic goals of the masses within an oppressive and exploitative framework of a capitalist society. Whenever revolutionary tendencies begin to show, they are cut short or nipped in the bud by a false fulfillment of wish dreams, that of wealth, adventure, passionate love, power, sensationalism in general. The culture industry promotes the need for instant gratification, and it discourages the masses from thinking beyond the confines of the present. The Frankfurt School proposes that culture is commodified, that it serves to devalue authentic culture by transforming it into just another saleable commodity. Now, these ideas presented by Adorno, Horkheimer, Lowenthal can be used to examine advertisements and look at how they promote a particular lifestyle, which in turn serves to shape our identity to the benefit of capitalist society. I will end with a quote from Noah Yuval Harari, author of Sapiens, where he says that people are constantly told to follow our dreams. We are all told to follow our dream. But he asks, whose dream is it? Is it our own dream or one that is created by the prompts of capitalism? So every cultural text or practice can be looked at from the perspective of how it promotes a capitalistic economy and how this in turn makes us believe that we need things, we need to consume, we need to own certain things, we need to be at certain cultural programs in order to create an idea or an impression of oneself. One important piece of advice that I would like to conclude with, and that is, in order to make your answers effective, please ensure that you have a thorough theoretical foundation for all the case studies that you present, and ensure that your case studies are relevant and contemporary. Thank you very much.